Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us here at the Fairfax County Master Gardeners Association Virtual Plant Clinic. I will be speaking on perennial blooming from spring to autumn. And once I get started, if you could hold your questions to the end, I'd appreciate that. I'm Kathleen Gilman, and I've been gardening most of my life since about age 12. I grew up in New England, but have lived in Northern Virginia for more than 30 years. I've been a homeowner for almost 19 years and gardening in my yard all those years. I'm a first-year intern with the Master Gardeners. I plan to focus on herbaceous, flowering perennial plants, not shrubs and trees. And what's in front of me right here is right in my front garden, in front of my house. Those are Asiatic lilies, which are perennial. I also plan to talk a lot from my personal experience in my own yard. The plants I'll feature have thrived in my gardens, so likely this will be very practical information for you as you garden in Fairfax County. Perennials can be planted anytime during the growing season, but do best planted at least a month before winter weather arrives. That's potted perennials. You wouldn't want to start seeds a month before the winter weather arrives. And I learned that from Sue Dickinson, Assistant Professor of Horticulture at Northern Virginia Community College. So this month is actually a great time to plant some perennials in your garden. This is my backyard, where you can see hostas and wood poppies and lamb's ear and ferns. That again is my front yard. And I'd like to take a moment to define what perennials are. Herbaceous perennials do not have woody stems, so they're not shrubs or trees. And the fact that they have woody stems means most of them die back to the ground in winter. Yet they have persistent root systems, or bulbs, that survive the winter, so they regrow after winter when the weather warms up. Annuals, in contrast, annuals do not regrow in the spring. Annuals are programmed to complete their life cycle in one growing season. They sprout, they grow, they flower, they set seed, and they die in 1 year or less. They often give a showy display of blooms from spring till autumn frost. However, they need to be replanted the following spring. Perennials don't. There's a couple other herbaceous plants used in Northern Virginia gardens that I'm not especially going to talk about tonight. Tropicals, which of course would not survive our frosts and would die in the winter unless you bring them into the house. And biennials are, they take 2 years to flower. So they actually do make it through one winter, and usually they flower the second growing season. Why would you bother using flowering perennials in your garden? Well, I think I've already stressed the first point. They don't need to be replanted every spring. They are long lasting. Most last several years, and peonies last several generations. Some are reblooming, and you can encourage reblooming with deadheading. Many are easy to care for, and the ones I'll be showing you are pretty easy to care for. They've managed to survive in my gardens. Perennials also have a variety of habits. Some are shade loving, some are sun loving. And again, this is the point where you need to think about the right plant for the right spot to examine where you have sun and how much sun in your yard versus where you have shady spots. Perennials also vary in size. They can be tall, they can be small enough to be ground cover. They have a variety of foliage in texture and color, and they vary in bloom time. That's one reason I can show you perennials that bloom from February through October. And some are hardy and will actually tolerate light frost. An example would be Helioborus. And many are self-propagating, so you're going to have more eventually. An opportunity to divide and fill in places in your own garden, or perhaps give some plants away. Rudbeckia hirta, Echinacea, and Japanese Anemone are examples of those. And here is a native visitor, the goldfinch, visiting Echinacea. And that's in my front yard. Why use flowering perennials in your garden? Because both native and non-native perennials will support pollinators and attract wildlife like the goldfinches you just saw. Some are deer resistant and some provide winter interest. And as I mentioned before, potted perennials can be planted anytime during the growing season, but it's best done a month before the frost is anticipated. Perennial blooms from February to October. At this point, I'm going to show you a series of slides of perennials that bloom in my yard across the growing season. Very early bloomers, Helioborus. And this plant has rather stiff foliage that actually sometimes lasts it does last right through the winter season in my yard. And this blooms as early as February in my yard. And here's another variety of the Helioborus. The flower heads tend to be nodding, so in order for me to get this picture, I had to get down on my knees to show you the beauty of those magenta flowers. Other early bloomers, of course, include your bulbs. Tete-a-tete daffodil, which is the small daffodil in the center there, I think is one of my favorite. I have lots of those throughout my garden. And crocuses, which are enduring a light March frost, or snow, I mean to say. Other early bloomers, well, here's an exception. I'm showing you camellia, which actually is a shrub, and it holds its foliage throughout the winter, so it is evergreen. And this one is blooming in the spring, in mid-April. There also are camellias that will bloom in the fall, and some of them real early in the winter. In the foreground, there is some narcissus and some Helioborus, so you can see a contrast in the size. That shrub is over my head. It's about 7 or 8 feet tall. And of course, there's plenty of bulbs out there, which will come back year to year, like the tulips you see on the left, more daffodils up above on the right, and bleeding heart, which is not a native. Actually, none of these that I've just mentioned are natives. The bleeding heart, the pink flowers on the bottom. I wanted to focus just a moment on wood poppy, which is the yellow flowering plant in the center there beneath the stone steps. And actually there's a touch of it on the left side of the round picture. This is a native, a North American native. And it produces a seed that is a capsule from those yellow flowers. And the flowers are generally 1 to 2 inches across. Mine are always at least 2 inches across. It's a relatively small plant. It only grows to be about 1 foot, maybe 2 feet. One interesting thing is it has yellow sap if you should break a piece off. And the flowers can be more of an orange, I understand, but the ones I have are always this nice bright yellow. And it is an excellent perennial that blooms in the shade, and I've never had deer bother it. It's a native. Another native is the one I'm showing you here, wild geranium or cranesbill, which is not to be confused with the zonal geraniums you'll see in the garden nursery, which absolutely need full sun and are indeed annuals, at least in our environment. This plant, like I said, is a native. It prefers part shade, and here you see it blooming in late April. And this actually just grew in my, I have woods that merge with my backyard, so it just grew back there on the edge of the woods. Moving along into May, Maycora Bells or Hampshire is also a North American native. This will grow in full sun, but it prefers part shade with our hot summers here in Virginia. It prefers well-drained soil, and that little fact explains why I haven't been able to keep this particular perennial growing more than maybe 4 or 5 years in my yard because of our Virginia clay. I guess the soil needs good amendment to give it soil that's going to drain. This plant, though, comes in many varieties. Their foliage is in all sorts of colors, like kind of gold and maroon. And this one actually, I don't know if you can see it well, this foliage is a little bit variegated. And they all have nice blossoms that are short-lived but attractive. Also in May, iris come out, and so do, that's Russian sage on the left, and 2 kinds of iris, peach and lavender. They're not long-lived, but they do have many blossoms on each stem, like daylilies. And then on the right, what's blooming at this point is azaleas. Okay, I've thrown in another shrub. In June, I have a true profusion of blooms. Working left to right through these photographs, on the left, the lavender blooms are Veronica, the upright Veronica. There is also a ground cover that goes by the same name, and I think they're related. And there's a bee. You may not be able to see it, but this does attract pollinators. The rosy pink flowers are yarrow in that photograph. The center photograph is when the common daylily, which is the orange lily in the center, that comes into profuse blossom in June. And in the foreground in red, you're seeing bee balm, which is called, the scientific name is Monarda, and beneath it is more of the pink rosy yarrow. And on the right is a collection of lilies. We have daylilies in the foreground in peach, and the tall upright lilies are Asiatic lilies. Again, all of these, actually the Asiatic lilies last like a week or more, and there's several buds. Actually, they probably last 2 or 3 weeks because of the number of buds on the stem. Daylilies are similar. Daylilies actually, I wanted to make the contrast. Daylilies, the reason they're called daylilies is because each blossom only lasts 24 hours and then it's finished. With the Asiatic lilies, the whole stem and the blossoms last quite a bit longer. The daylily, however, has several blossoms per stem, so you do get quite a show with daylilies as each bud comes into bloom. For shade, astilbe and ferns do exceptionally well in June. And astilbes, that's the flowering plant on, well, it's more on the left in the photo, it's right in the center of the slide, do come in different colors, white, red, different pinks. This is kind of a lavender pink. In July, my garden again is in full swing with lots of blooming perennials. At this point, Echinacea starts blooming, and Echinacea is right front and center there with the lavender petals, a daisy-like flower, and kind of a rusty colored center, which grows up to be more of a cone, explaining the name coneflower, the common name. And I just wanted to point out that there's several Echinacea blossoms in different stages of maturity in this slide. Toward the bottom, you see some kind of scraggly looking green round. They're blossoms before they've really become blossoms. That's pretty much the bud. And then above the lavender blossom that I started to describe, the one in the center, just above it is one that's just coming out, and its petals look more like white. As it matures, it will become more purple. Now, bee balm is looking a little bit seedy. That's the red flower behind the Echinacea. And that's just normal. It's actually eventually going to go to seed because that gets a lot of visitors. It gets bees, birds, hummingbirds, and butterflies. And then common daylily, which is on the right-hand corner of the picture, they're peaking in July and finishing their blooming. In August, the Echinacea has peaked, and here's a lovely butterfly that it's attracted. Rudbeckia, which is Blackeyed Susan, is also at peak. And I'm hoping you can see the lamb's ear in the upper right-hand corner. There's just a bit of it there. It has silvery, almost gray foliage because it's fuzzy. It's very fuzzy foliage, and that is also blooming and attracting pollinators at this time. Here's the Blackeyed Susans in my garden. I wanted to just point out it's surrounded by some iris. See those sword-like leaves? Some of those are beginning to look a little peaked. They're going yellow. Iris has finished its blooming 2 months ago, and it's starting to head towards resting and dying back as the hot summer sun and the season comes to a close. Behind the Blackeyed Susans, I'd just like to mention threadleaf coreopsis. You see many tiny yellow flowers, and this year, that threadleaf coreopsis has been blooming steadily for 2 solid months, which I think is pretty amazing for a perennial. Here we have Sedum Joy, another pollinator attractor, and this is a very common plant in our Virginia gardens. And behind it are some daylilies, and their leaves have dried out a bit. And at this point, I sometimes clean up my daylilies by pulling out the dried stalks from the finished flowering period. Here's tall Veronica, also called Speedwell. This is actually an early picture. I think I took this in June, a couple of years back. It will continue blooming through August and maybe beyond if you give it a good deadhead. All those little purple spires can be trimmed off once they start to go to seed. As we get to late summer, August and entering September, I just wanted to show you a couple plants that do well in shade to part sun. Wingstem, Verbensina species, is native. And that, I understand, it was encouraged to be planted to encourage pollination in fields like, I think in the early 20th century. And Japanese anemone is not a native, but it does grow in part sun. And at this point in August, it's just beginning to bloom. A few more details about Japanese anemone, because this is one of your late season bloomers. On the top is Honoré Joubert, that's the variety in white. That is an heirloom variety and is quite tall, about 3 to 4 feet. And actually, this picture is from last year. My Honoré Joubert plant currently just has buds on it. So it's not quite come into bloom, and it will bloom through October once it gets started. Curtain Call Pink on the bottom is also a Japanese anemone, and that one is in full flush of bloom right now. Now monkshod, Icotinum, begins to bloom probably next month. It just has buds on it. Okay, Japanese anemones are slow to start in the spring. You won't see them right away. I read one thing that recommended planting bulbs around them because the bulbs will be up and will be finished blooming when you start to see the foliage of Japanese anemones. I read that it's fine in full sun and thrives in dappled shade. I've got a question mark there about full sun because in our hot, humid Virginia summers, I don't think it's so happy being in full sun. I would recommend part shade. It likes well-drained, nutrient-rich soil. Many are tall. There are a few shorter varieties, and because they're tall, sometimes they need staking. And one of the features is the bright yellow center that you see on the Curtain Call Pink there on the right. Other autumn bloomers for shade. Here's where I have the monkshod, which is on the right with a blossom for you to see. It blossoms in purple or in blue. There's obviously different varieties, and it's the very tall plant that is up against the siding of my house there. In front of it, on the right, are astilbe seed heads. This is another shade lover, and it has plumy panicles of flowers, which I showed you earlier come in different colors, like lavender or pink or white. And it now is bearing its seeds and could be kept there for winter interest. And it probably would be eaten by birds and other critters. And on the left, in the center, are Montauk daisy blossoms. That is another, well, okay, I've kind of hedged on this one. I have Montauk daisy in a relatively shady spot. It's probably getting somewhere between 4 to 5 hours of sun a day. It's in my backyard and it's getting a lot of afternoon shade where it's located. So it hasn't even started to bloom. I went out and checked it today and it's got a bud on it coming, so I don't expect to see blooms for maybe a month. And the Montauk daisy is named after Montauk, New York on Long Island, but it's not native to the US. Its native habitat is actually Asia, China, I believe. And I just wanted to show you a few slides of daylilies. I think they're probably one of my favorites, and you can see in the background some of the beautiful buds that will come out in succession, giving you a fairly long time with the daylilies. There's many varieties of daylilies. These are some of the fancier ones. You may be familiar with the common orange daylily that has skinnier petals, more like these red daylilies on the right. But they've been breeding. There's more daylilies than I think you can count variety-wise, and there's some amazing colors out there. Now, I was reading that daylilies are not native. So if you prefer to grow something native that's orange, like your common daylily, you might want to try butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. It goes by other names, swallowwort, pleurisy root. And I think it's happier in sun, but it will flower in light shade. It is similar to common milkweed, but it's a different plant. It lacks the milky sap of common milkweed, and the pods are smaller. It is drought tolerant, and it does tend to sprawl in our damp summers because its natural tendency in a fair amount of sun, in full sun, is to actually become more bushy, almost like a small shrub. And it indeed is a host plant to the monarch butterfly and provides nectar for both monarchs and other butterflies and insects that would come along. Moving this plant once established is not advised. I tried it, it didn't work. The reason it didn't work, it has almost like a taproot. It has a very strong root that goes straight down, and if you don't get enough of that root, it's not going to be happy and it will not survive. But it is great, like I said, in sun to part shade. And here's bee balm, which I just wanted to spend a moment giving you a few more details about. Monarda didyma, it's the red flower in the picture, kind of front and center. Also goes by the names wild bergamot and Oswego tea. It likes sun to partial shade. I have it in a place where it's getting partial shade. It grows erect with square stems. That gives you a hint that it's in the mint family. Consequently, it's a good spreader when it's in a place where it's happy. It's best in rich, moist soil, it's best in rich soil that is moisture retentive. And it really attracts hummingbirds. I've seen them there, butterflies and bees, and it's recommended to divide it either in spring or fall. And I also read that this sometimes, no, not this one. It's the butterfly weed actually sometimes blooms twice. Okay, here's a sheet with my references. I get Garden Gate magazine, which has a wonderful article this current issue on Japanese anemone, and the Xerxes Society has put out an amazing book, 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. Native Perennials for the Southeast by Peter Lower. Those two books, the Xerxes book and the Native Perennials for the Southeast, are available at Fairfax County Public Libraries. Perennials for American Gardens, there is a more recent edition. I just happen to have an older edition. And Missouri Botanical Garden is wonderful for finding out more details about plants. Thank you so much for listening. I'm ready to answer any questions you might have at this point.
You have a question in the chat from Sissy. And
Okay.
the question is, do you recommend dividing daylilies in the fall or early spring also? Any gotchas when dividing daylilies? And
Well,
great session.
yeah, I've read that daylilies can be divided either spring or fall. Now, I guess I would have a tendency to choose the fall, because at that point, because most daylilies are deciduous and they die completely back down to the ground. So in the fall, you can see the full extent of their footprint and get a better idea where you need to put your shovel to dig it up and then divide it. So that's why I would do it in the fall. But I've read that you can also do it in the spring. Did that answer the question?
Kathleen, I had a question about your echinaceas and your rutabacias.
Okay.
I have those now in my garden, and I was just wondering, do you need to cut them down like around now to get a second bloom, or do they have a second bloom on those echinaceas? And doing your research, did you find out about that? Or do they have a second bloom basically?
You know, I don't tend to cut them down to force a second bloom. I'm trying to think. Okay, the Echinacea tends to have one strong stalk and not a lot of side shoots, whereas the Blackeyed Susan tends to have side shoots and almost be like shrub-like if it has enough space. The reason I don't cut down the Echinacea is because goldfinches just love them, and they're a good source of nutrition for those birds. So I leave them up. So I guess I forgo the possibility of getting a second flush of bloom by not trimming them back, not deadheading them.
Okay.
So the heads are there for the birds.
Got it. And then, but do you trim them at the end of the, go close to the spring season to start for the whole new season again?
Yes, you can leave them out through the winter and they can give you nice winter interest in your garden. But you're right. Once spring starts to come, then you got to pull those stalks out, and they do die back. So you will see the green leaves coming up again as the soil gets warm enough.
In the daylilies, right? Are they really just they flower only like a one day or so, or a couple of days, or?
Well, how it works is the daylily puts up a stalk, and on the stalk usually there's 5, 6, 7, sometimes more buds. So the buds mature in succession. So the most mature one will bloom, and it literally does last just 24 hours. You'll see it opening in the morning, and by the end of the day, it's pretty well spent. By the next day, it's done.
Wow.
But what happens is those other buds are at different rates of maturity, and a day or so later, the next one will come out, and it will expire in 24 hours, and a day or so later, a third, and so on. And because they grow in a clump, there's usually several stalks. When a daylily is immature, it's got like one stalk, maybe two. But as the plant gets more mature, and as it gets to the point where you're going to need to divide it, it might put up a dozen stalks, and you're going to have quite a show.
Got it. Okay, that's excellent, because I was thinking, oh, wow, only one day. But yeah, I think I've seen daylilies that are continually flowering.
Mm-hmm. And the neat thing about daylilies is, because I was studying this, I like them so well.
Uh-huh.
They have, well, some of them have evergreen foliage, some of them are semi-evergreen, but most of them do die back in the winter as far as the foliage goes. The other point I wanted to make is, oh, they have different bloom times. Some are like early season, like the common daylilies, pretty early, and it's usually finished.